So we started last week looking at the Olivet Discourse. The neat thing is we will be in the Olivet Discourse in Mark, just a few weeks. It's in Mark chapter 13, and we begin Mark chapter 11 today. So as we'll see in Mark 11 today, Jesus is finally in Jerusalem, and he will be in Jerusalem and around the outside of Jerusalem for the next week, the last week of his life. It's during this time that he gives this Olivet Discourse, and it's in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And there's slight variations, and some of the Gospels contribute some information that fills in the gap for one of the others, and you kind of compile the three together, and you can get a pretty clear picture. Excuse me. Pretty clear picture of what he's trying to convey. And we saw last week, we're going to finish the discourse today pretty much, and we were almost through it. So we'll do a little bit of recap. We saw last week the triumphal entry where Jesus comes in and cleanses the temple, and we saw some parables that were related to the destruction of Jerusalem. And we see a big thing we see in Matthew chapter 23 are what we would call the 7 woes of Jesus, where he pronounces, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, woe to you, hypocrites. He does this 7 times. I think it's very particular because if you remember, we looked last week in Leviticus 26, where God is speaking to his people and says, if you continue to rebel, I will punish you 7 times more. And then if you still won't repent, I'll punish you 7 times more. He does this 4 times in this chapter. And another interesting thing is at the beginning of Matthew, in chapter 5, you have the Beatitudes, the blessings on those who are in the kingdom. And here at the end of Jesus' ministry, you have the 7 woes. And I love the kind of the parallelism there of those who are with Christ and those who are opposed to Christ. But he gives these woes and then ends chapter 23 with his lamentation over Jerusalem. He says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." He says, I wanted to gather your children, but you, speaking of Jerusalem, not the city itself, but what the city represents, the religious leaders, right? The Pharisees, the scribes, the ones who were to be supposed to be a light to the people, ended up preventing the Messiah, the light of the Messiah, from shining, so to speak. He says, "See, your house is left to you desolate. I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And then we go into chapter 24, where the disciples ask him, hey, when will these things take place? What is the sign that we should be looking for? And if you remember, we put a timestamp on this because in chapter 23, is it chapter 23? It's leading up to it. I think it's 23. Yeah, where he says in verse 35, so that on you may come all the righteous bloodshed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. People who look at the phrasing this generation and they throw it somewhere way out in the future, what they're saying is that God is going to punish some future generation for everything where Jerusalem has slain the blood of Abel to Zechariah, which was well over 2,000 years ago. But God's piling that up for some future generation. But the reality is, Jesus says this generation. So the generation where Jesus was living and breathing in his incarnation before the crucifixion, that generation was going to experience the wrath of God. And we also find that phrasing, remember, in chapter 24 that puts a time restraint on this, where he says in verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. He says, this is the truth. This is what's going to happen. But what happens is you've got skeptics, people who are anti-religious or skeptical of religion. They look at this verse and they use it to substantiate or try to substantiate their belief that Jesus is a false prophet. What did he say? He said, all this will take place before this generation. Now, because of, let's say, the the hyper dispensational people who would look at Matthew 24 and see pretty much all of it being way in the future. They believe that what Jesus says is going to happen here in 24, Jesus doesn't intend to happen for at least now 2,000 years. But then that doesn't make sense. The skeptics look and say, well, that's not what he said. He said this generation. And so what we say is Jesus is not a false prophet. What he prophesied would happen actually did happen within that generation. Literally, it depends on how you break down the crucifixion. If it was in the spring of the year 30, or the spring of the year 33, because the destruction that came upon Jerusalem came in the spring of the year 70. So the case is stronger that Jesus said this in 33, which would make it 37 years later instead of 40. But a biblical thinking of a generation is 40 years. A generation wandering in the wilderness until they all died off because of their unbelief. So that's the whole point of this Olivet discourse. Even though it's using this great cosmic language, we've seen in the past 3 or 4 weeks, I guess, how this language was very common in the Old Testament for destruction of a nation. The heavens were shaking and the idols were melting, or the idols were trembling, and men's hearts were melting, and the stars were falling from heaven. Oh yeah, this was when the Medes and Persians conquered Babylon. That was clear in Isaiah, Isaiah 16, Isaiah 30, 34. It's just this hyperbolic, exaggerated, we would call decreation language when God is about to judge a nation. And Jesus uses the same language in Matthew 24. And we have to understand that that's how his audience would have understood this as well. So where we left off last week was we were going to talk about where's it at here? We saw false prophets. I think we're going to pick up in verse 29. Yeah, the coming of the Son of Man. So verses 29 to 31, immediately after the tribulation of those days. The tribulation has a lot of discussion. It's talked about in the future. If you remember, if you guys want your charts, I didn't think to hand any out. But if you remember, if you look at the dispensational timeline, you've got, I made some other here we go. I'll do it this way. The top one on that. Yeah, the top one there. And I made some more because last week I thought we would have Lori's class join, but they didn't. They did their own thing. So I had some extras. Anyway, if you remember, if you look at the dispensational chart or the historic premill chart, either one, you have the last days decline and then the great tribulation era, right? That's on the historic, and then the dispensational premillennial, last days decline, great tribulation, and then the return of Christ. For the dispensational, you have the rapture, then the tribulation, then the return of Christ. But Jesus here's what we have to do. We have to understand Scripture in the context of Scripture. Right here, Jesus is referencing a tribulation, right? He says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, this time that he's talking about. And he says this in verse 29. If you look down, after 29 comes 30, 34, 35, 30, all the way down to 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. That's the time marker that makes whatever verses 29 through 31 mean have already taken place. Now remember, in my opening prayer, I said we've got to hold on to those essentials and affirm those essentials. When Jesus ascended at the Mount of Olives, at the end, when he ascended, and we see it actually in the opening chapter of the book of Acts, the angel said, the same Jesus that you see taken from you will come again in the same way you saw him go. And he's going to come with power and great glory in the same way. What's described here is a little bit different. So if you remember in Isaiah chapter 13, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud in judgment, coming to destroy Egypt. The Egyptians, not a single one of them, looked up and saw the Lord or some spirit or any kind of visible thing surfing on the clouds. That's not what they saw. And when Isaiah is writing this oracle against Egypt, when Egypt is destroyed by, I believe it was Babylon at that time, Israel understood that that was a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. They didn't say, no, this can't be it because no one saw the Lord cloud surfing. Right? They understood that was the nature of apocalyptic literature. So immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Right? That's what it says in Matthew 24 verse 29. But that same language again is used multiple times in the Old Testament describing judgment upon a nation. Now we could say that this is literal and that the sun literally is darkened, the sky is black, the moon does no longer shine for whatever reason, and stars or asteroids or meteors or whatever falls from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. The problem is, you look down at verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So the generation that Jesus is pronouncing judgment on, which was the generation living and breathing when he was walking the earth, they experienced this according to that time restraint. And that works if we understand the same language used in the Old Testament of the destruction of Egypt, the destruction of Babylon, the destruction of the Medo-Persian Empire, and future for when Jesus is speaking, even of the Roman Empire. So this global language does not necessarily mean that when, for instance, when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, that the colors of the sky were really dark and the sun didn't shine and stars fell from heaven because the people all the way on the other side of the earth, over here in the North American continent, were just living their normal lives. They saw nothing in the sky. They saw, they didn't, it's not that the sun didn't shine for a while and meteors and asteroids fell. It's a cosmic deconstruction, decreation language that is very, very common. But he says, then will appear in heaven, not the Son of Man. In verse 30, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from the one end of heaven to the other. One thing that's true, Jesus will return. There will be a final judgment. There will be a final resurrection. There will be, however we want to understand the rapture, whoever's alive when Jesus returns. There will be a recreation, a new heaven and a new earth, said the judgment, the eternal state. There will be all of those things. You've got the end of Revelation that tells us that. You've got 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that tells us this. You've got Acts chapter 1 that tells us this. But this is something different. Just because we understand this to be something that's already taken place does not mean that the Lord himself will not still descend from heaven with a shout, with the trump of God, the voice of the archangel, and the dead in Christ rise, right? But this is something different. It has to be because of the time restraint. So the people who say that this hasn't happened yet, they will look at verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. They redefine the word generation. They redefine this word to mean this type of people, this type of world, this type of society. And so we still live in that type of society, and we're going to live until in this type of society until these things take place. But there's no reason to redefine the word generation to mean that. They redefine the word generation to mean that because they have to, because they reject what Jesus seems to clearly say here, that this generation will not pass away, that he's talking about this one particular generation. And so what happens, he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call that will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Cosmic language of the gathering in of God's people. What it is, it's the doing away of the covenant-breaking Israel sacrificial system, the temple, The priesthood is the doing away of all of that. And it's a gathering together of the church. The called out ones, the church being gathered together. Because even, this is very interesting for you to note here, when it says in verse 30, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. It's the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. So we're talking about the Daniel 7 picture where the Son of Man goes on the clouds and comes to the Ancient of Days and receives dominion and a kingdom and those things. The sign that this has happened is the things that are taking place. So when all this destruction is coming on God's covenant breaking people on Jerusalem, when the Roman army is destroying them, that is, I would understand that to be the sign showing that the Son of Man is who he says he is, and he's in heaven because he's being vindicated over those who crucified him. But an interesting thing to note here, it says all the tribes of the earth will mourn when they see this happening. The word for earth here is the Greek word gay, and it means earth or land. So this word, the same word, is also translated in the New Testament for land, like the land of Israel, when they inherit the land. It's the exact same word. And it means either a particular plot of land, a particular area, or it could mean the whole earth, depending on the context. Here we just have to make a determination. Is it talking about the tribes of the earth? So think about it this way. Let's say that this is about to happen. It's about to happen in the next 5 years. We are a nation, the United States, 50 states united together. Not a single one of us are a tribe, right? When you think of tribes, what are you thinking about? The 12 tribes is the tribes of Israel. That's how the word tribe always seems to be understood. You know, later you see God has redeemed the people in Revelation from every tribe, tongue, and nation. So it goes everywhere else. But here, it's talking about the tribes of the earth. So it very realistically could read the tribes of the land will mourn when they see him, just like the Egyptians saw him in Isaiah 13 when they really didn't, right? But it was what happened was clear that the judgment was from him. And then in verse 32, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place, right? And then verse 36, here's where it gets a little interesting too. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Here's the thing. Jesus, at this moment when he said this, in his humanity, he didn't know the day. But he knew the time, because he said all these things will take place before this generation is ended. Now, the particular day, he didn't know. If you go to the opening verses of Revelation, we'll look at Revelation here soon, maybe next week, I don't know. It's a revelation of Jesus Christ that God gave him to show the apostle things that must soon take place. So Jesus, when he gave this discourse on the Mount of Olives, in that moment, he didn't know the day or the hour. Would we say today that Jesus in heaven doesn't know the day or the hour? He's omniscient. He knows all things. In this particular instance, in his humanity, he knew the generation. He knew it would be coming very soon, within 40 years, but he didn't have a specific date to give them. But he said, you'll see these signs. You'll see all these signs pointing to this in this generation, so be ready. For, as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered it. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them away, the flood of judgment. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then, now here, I'll quiz you on what you think, what you always heard that this means. Then 2 men will be in the field, and one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, and one taken and one left. What does that sound like? And any suggestions on that? I won't leave you on the spot. That's usually a verse about the rapture. That's usually a verse about the rapture because you got, if you think about the dispensational position, where the trumpet sounds and bam, one's taken, another is left, right? It's like, oh, where'd everyone go? Because someone's taken and other people are left. Two women grinding in a mill, one taken, the other left. But this is still within that time constraint. When Rome sacked Jerusalem in 70 AD, they surrounded and started it took them about 5 months, I think, to breach the wall and to starve the people out. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that a little bit more. It was a horrible, horrible time. Talking about a tribulation, it was a horrible time. But many people were killed. Josephus records about 1 million. 1 million people, Jews, were killed in Jerusalem. But many were taken to Roman captivity and they were marched in as prisoners of war. And some were left. And they were left in all the rubble. They were left with nothing. They were left with all their family gone. They were left with their city burned to the ground. They were left in no temple. One was taken, another was left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master set over his household to give them their food in the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find doing so when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I will concede this is a secondary issue or even a third tier issue. Most that are not futurists like dispensationals, most will see verses 1 through 35 about Jerusalem. They say, okay, we can get that. We're okay with that. It's the destruction of Jerusalem. But 36 says, but concerning that day, no one knows. There's a shift. He's talking about the final judgment then. And it's okay. It's okay if we believe that, because if we're wrong about these set of verses, whether it's judgment on Jerusalem or judgment at the end of time, we're okay. Like we can believe either way and be okay. We've got to have those essentials. But it does not seem to me that Jesus changes the language. At least down to verse 35 has to be in Jerusalem because of what he says about this generation not passing away. It's possible verse 36 changes and it talks about a future coming of the Lord. I don't think so. I think there's other passages that support that, and I don't see a good reason for Jesus to change topics here. However, when we get to chapter 25, we're not looking at it right now, chapter 25 does seem to make a shift because 25 opens with, then the kingdom of heaven will be like, and he gives a parable of the 10 virgins. And there seems to be a long delay, a long waiting here. The parable of the talents comes next. It'll be like a man going on a long journey, and his servant's been entrusted with property, and he's been gone a long time. There seems to be a long delay picture here. And then at the end of 25, you do have what looks like the final judgment beginning at 31. So I think chapter 24 deals with Jerusalem, and all of 25 deals with the future and the awaiting judgment. I just don't think that starts back in 24, if that makes sense. So if you've ever heard a walkthrough of Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, you've probably not heard it this way. This is a rare position, but it seems to be the straightforward position. And it's a minority position now, but it didn't used to be. You look even in early church history, they understood the Olivet Discourse to be about the destruction of Jerusalem. You look, the medieval church fathers believed that. The early commentaries on Matthew taught that. The Reformers taught that. The Puritans taught that. But then in the 1800s, with this hyper-dispensational position, they began throwing Matthew 24 into the future. And actually, when he says not one stone left upon another of the temple, a lot of them say, okay, yeah, Jesus is talking about the temple that he sees right there, but there's a future temple that's going to be destroyed too, because they can't help but just take Matthew 24 and fling it way into the future. We got no reason to do that. especially with him telling them what they're going to see and what they're going to experience. He says they're going to persecute you. They're going to bring you into the synagogues, and they're going to beat you. And it's like, they're not bringing me into a synagogue, right? Like that doesn't look like that's going to happen. There's synagogues around here, but I don't think that they're going to come get me and drag me from my family into a synagogue and put me on trial. But they literally did that with the apostles, right? So another key thing is, we'll say this and we'll wrap it up for today. When Jesus says, because we didn't talk about this much, and we'll probably pick back up with it again next week. In verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. The one who is on the housetop not go down to take what's in his house. When Luke writes the same thing, Luke does not say when you see the abomination of desolation. He says when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. When the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem leading up to 70 AD, this was the note for the Christians who were in, the ones who had Jesus' words here, who were in Jerusalem. They said, oh, we've got to get out of here now. But they can't get out because Jerusalem is surrounded by the Roman army. Well, while they're surrounded is when Nero kills himself in 68 AD, when Rome is there trying to get Jerusalem and trying to conquer Jerusalem. He kills himself, and it throws the Roman Empire into a time of civil war, civil unrest. Thought the kingdom was like, man, Rome has been an empire for 400 years. It's falling apart right now. The armies pull back long enough for every Christian in Jerusalem to flee. And historically, they went to a place called Pella, and that's where they camped out, and they were secure, and they were safe. And then all the people who said, we're staying with the temple. This is God's house. He's not going to abandon us. We've got the temple on our side. We've got the sacrifices. We've got the priesthood. We killed Jesus, but we reject him as the Messiah, and God's not going to turn his back on us. Every one of them were destroyed, taken into captivity, left behind, whatever the case would be. But this is why I let the one who is on the housetop not go back into his house, and the one who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. When this happens, it's time to get out of town. You can buy you another house. You can get you another cloak. Whatever's on your housetop that you used to make a living with, if you go back and get it, you might get stuck in Jerusalem. You got to get out. So the army's surrounded, and the first chance all the Christians had, they made a run for it. And this is a historical account. They fled. That fits perfectly here. Even without knowing exactly what the abomination of desolation is, it's a desecration of the temple, is what it is. And Daniel prophesied of one that happened, and then here Jesus is referring to one, and it's looking like the one that Daniel prophesied about that happened in a certain way. And here, with the Roman Empire, they are desecrating the temple, and the temple was absolutely desecrated, absolutely destroyed, don't even exist anymore. So that is the gist of Matthew chapter 24.